All right. Happy Friday, everyone. And I hope you've had a great week. We are back here with another episode of Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to explore the landscape of learning technology while cutting through the fluff and getting your questions answered. So today I'm joined by Shah and Tom White, and they are from Kahuna Workforce Solutions. And we're going to be demystifying this whole competency management. If you haven't seen the post this week, that's what we're going to be digging into, exploring a little bit more of what that looks like and why it matters. If you're joining us live right now, go ahead, give us a thumbs up, share the post, tag in somebody who may be trying to tackle this challenge themselves right now and would benefit from the conversation. And while you're at it, right, this is an interactive session as always, but to get things started, comment in and tell us where you are joining from in the world today. So I will go round robin with this one. Mine's always boring because it's always the same. I'm in Waukesha, Wisconsin, where I always am, even though I did shift up my office a little bit ago. But let's go with Jai first.
Hey guys, I am coming to you from San Diego, California today.
San Diego, California. And if last week, I had one of the guests, no, not last week, 2 weeks ago, I think, one of the guests was from California. It's clearing up there, right? With the fires
It's
and all that.
It's absolutely clearing up, yeah. We got a break from the fires a bit, so okay. Good news there.
The skies are clear here too, so I have to assume the smoke is not making its way over. All right, how about you, Tom?
So I am high and dry in Houston, Texas, just recovering from that nice storm that hit. But we're all good. I heard that we're getting some autumn weather coming down soon as well, which is going to be nice.
All right. So it's cooling off?
It's starting to cool off. Yeah, still pretty warm, but last few days.
What's pretty warm, by the way? What's pretty warm?
Well, for me, I'm from the UK, so anything that isn't grey and raining is pretty warm for me, but we're hitting like 90 to 100. For the last week, it's been more like 80. So that's pretty nice. Okay.
All right. Yeah, that's pretty warm without being too hot. All right. That's an accept. Yeah. I accept that answer. Thank you, Tom.
Being here long enough to start.
All right. So what's that?
I've been in Houston long enough to start to understand like the weather and what is happening.
There you go. You're getting the hang of it. Okay. So before we get into competency management, learning tech, all this fun stuff, let's do our completely non-related question. And everybody, you can play along as well. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I'm going to reverse the order though. So Tom, what part of elementary school do you wish you could incorporate into your adult life now?
It's a tricky one, but I think discovery, Chris. Like I've got a daughter who is not in elementary school just yet. She's in pre-K, but every day she comes home and is super excited about something new that she's learned. And right now at work with everything going on, it's just heads down, getting things done. It's really nice to discover new things and find out new things in the world. So that's what
you took that in a different angle than I was expecting, right? I like it was more the concept of the coming home, discovering something new. I was thinking it'd be like, craft time or something like that, but you really answered it.
My memory's so bad, I can't remember elementary school in the slightest. I was just playing it.
So there's the real reason. I honestly don't remember elementary school, so I'm gonna. I like that. Okay, Jai, how about you?
So I went to a community Montessori school in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where I grew up, where I was born, and it was a very free environment. Which was interesting when you're, in second and third grade. But one of the things that I discovered was that if you told your teacher you were going to just go out into the woods and write a haiku, they'd let you go outside and write a haiku. And I kind of wish I had that kind of flexibility these days where I could just tell everyone I'm going outside to write a haiku and disappear and hang out,
just say,
be with my thoughts.
We'll see you later.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Kahuna is a little stricter than that, so a little more formal. Yeah, I miss writing haikus in the woods. That's what I mean.
Okay, all right. Well, we've learned two things about you now, right? Not only what you did in elementary school, but that what you would do if you didn't have to do anything else. Write haikus. All right. So mine, I think back to elementary school. I was in a small private school in rural Minnesota, and I remember recess so well because we had so much cool, but most of it was we had like a huge space where they just let you go do whatever. So you wanted to run around until you couldn't run anymore because your legs were too tired, you could. And we didn't have all the fancy like playgrounds, and we didn't have all this other cool stuff. It was just like, here's a kickball, go run yourself ragged. And that to me was just, it was so simple. I think sometimes the simple things are the most fun. So that's mine. Okay. All right. Well, we won't spend too much time on that stuff yet. But so we're talking about Kahuna, this whole competency management piece, but getting into it, I'm curious, and you can both take a stab at this one. What was the genesis of where Kahuna came from, and how did it come to be? Like, what started the whole thing?
So I'll start, and I'm going to hand it off to Tom. But so it's funny, you're in Wisconsin. One of my first human capital management consulting engagements was at a company in Wisconsin, in Sheboygan. They make faucets, very, very skilled workforce, a lot of artisan craftsmen that came from the old world, and a very long tradition of understanding what made them special as an organization from a skills and competencies perspective. They were going through an HRIS transformation, and one of the things, they had built homegrown systems up until then, and one of the things they were really hoping to get out of that project was a deeper understanding and curation of those skills, competencies, and the ability to digitize that whole journey of understanding what it is from a skills perspective that made that company special, and then make sure that the knowledge transfer happened across generations within the workplace. And I remember thinking that if that should be the mission of HR, like if not that, what are we doing outside of transactional HR that results in a paycheck? So that really stuck with me. And what also stuck with me is that the enterprise technology we were implementing at the time, I was working for a big SI, had no real functionality to enable that. And that always stuck with me. And then fast forward about 16 years, Tom and I were working at a oil and gas company and saw the exact same problem, maybe a little less from a development perspective and a little bit more from a compliance and regulatory perspective, but still the need to understand granular skills and competencies. And so Tom was actually the analyst on that side of the project. And I'm wondering, Tom, if you maybe pick it up from there and tell the story of how we started to think about solving this problem.
Yeah, and it's funny that over that 16-year period, the same problem existed, right? The technology that you were implementing back then to the technology we were implementing at the oil and gas firm really hadn't solved for this problem at all. In fact, probably took a step back over that period of time. So yeah, happy to. So the big problem that we were trying to solve for was twofold at this client. So one was this integrated talent management goal of one system to solve every problem.
To solve them all, right?
One system, the one ring to
Panacea.
That's it. And that was really in vogue a few years back, right? Like that was the path that a lot of talent management execs were going down, and IT execs. We just found this very specific problem around competency assurance that it just could not solve for. The level of detail you need to get into, the taxonomy of assignment, of a validation, of reporting, just did not exist. So that's like the
Are you saying skills and competencies are complicated? Because I
don't know. Yeah, I don't know. We'll get into this. We'll get into this later, but I think that is a big takeaway, right? Even fast forward to today, like the big players in this space are trying to really speed a bit on how they can solve for this skills problem. But really, to the genesis of Kahuna, that was the spark. How can we solve for this specific problem and integrate that solution to the broader landscape?
Okay, got it. So as you were doing, because I think this is one of the interesting parts about this, because I think, Jai, to your point, one of the strategic roles of the space in learning and talent, HR, right, whatever category you want to throw it into, is this understanding of like what really does make the organization tick, and decrypting that in many regards so that you can do something with it. So when somebody says, okay, so what does Kahuna do, right? Because there's going to be folks who may be watching that are like, okay, you've said a lot of words that I've heard, competency management, all, but like, what does it do? How do you very succinctly explain to people, well, this is what our system does?
Absolutely. So our platform is a platform that allows you to curate a skills and competency framework, assign job-based and role-based competencies to individuals, validate their assessment, provide learning opportunities to close gaps, and then rolls all of that data up so that an organization can do more proactive workforce planning, employee development, investment philosophy on their learning, kind of learning journey to understand where dollars put into people development are actually going to make their workforce more competitive. So I know I said a lot more words there,
But that was actually right. There's a lot to say because to Tom's point earlier, this is complicated. It's not like,
yeah,
well, right, we assign videos out to people. It's a
right.
complicated mix.
One of the things that we like harp on is that skill management or competency management is its own business process, and it should be treated that way. Just like recruiting, compensation, learning is a business process, and our application fully supports that. And then, as Jai said, like something that we think is really key and like what is Kahuna is enablement. So use this data. If you think about like a hub and spoke model, we feel like we're in the center of that, and we can enable these other processes with our data. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where we're coming from.
And that tie to operations, that bridging the gap, common language between HR and operations, that's the key. If we're going after a fluffy, high level, pie in the sky competency initiative to maybe roll out 4 or 5 leadership or behavioral competencies, that's not what Kahuna is built for. And we would advise the customer, you've got a talent platform that can do that just fine. And you've probably got processes like a performance review and a continuous feedback loop where that stuff can get managed well. But if you're talking about granular, job-based, role-based, functional, and technical competencies that are going to move the needle in terms of your ability to dispatch your workers against specific job opportunities and collect experience and do more operationally related tasks and activities based on that data, that's what we're built for. And we're finding more and more customers are not only finding value in that, there's almost a necessity because of the rate of change being introduced into their workforce right now. How do I keep up with the change in technology, the change in demographics, the use of contingent workforce? How do I get this full picture and keep up with all of that?
Well, and I think it's an interesting point because you talked about it, right, where you said, well, if you're trying to do this more kind of the more smaller siloed approach of like, hey, we're just kind of trying to manage some competencies in this pocket, that's not necessarily where we play. Where we're playing, right, is in more this holistic look at that. To me, I think that's a shift that just needs to happen in general, right? That's not like a, well, you can do it this way or you can do it this way. Now, that's my opinion that it's like, no, we really should be thinking about this holistically because that's how you actually manage your workforce strategically and in a way that has impact on business, right? Actual business results and outcomes. Because you can say, well, we can actually mobilize our talent and we have visibility into who knows what and how they know and what can we do with that. That's
one thing that we often see, Chris, is when we have an early conversation with a new prospect and they don't have this, like you said, this holistic solution to skills and competency management. When we go and speak to like the people in charge of outcomes, like the business unit owner or the manager over an asset or something like that, or a unit, they do this, if not in a system, on a spreadsheet. This is something that is going on and being managed in these silos throughout the organization. And as we are learning as a learning community, like data is king. And so having all of this like data that you're not using, that's just sat out there, that's probably not consistent and adding value, is in itself a big value add, just to bring that together and have that kind of broader look at what's going on.
So and the other thing that's interesting about this, and then I have a follow-up question to that, is right, you talked about when you got into this space, this whole challenge of figuring out, what actually makes us tick and what makes our people work. That's not new. Like that's not a 2018 problem that suddenly came out of nowhere and then suddenly COVID, right? It wasn't an inception of COVID. It really was something organizations have been working on for a long time. So what's that evolution looked like a little bit in terms of, because I have to imagine the way you were doing it in the 90s versus the way you're doing it now looks a smidge of a bit different.
It does, and I think technology has a role to play here. But there is no replacing the hard work of understanding what different roles within the company are made up of in terms of processes, tasks, and ultimately the skills and competencies required to perform those. I think technology can help a lot in helping you define that. And certainly there's some more revolutionary approaches to rapid definition of and identification of critical skills, and not trying to boil the ocean and say we need this, 100 competency list for every single role in the company. Let's figure out what are the roles that are moving the needle from a business impact, business performance perspective, and let's start there. And then we can start, roll out to other people. But I think the big thing that's different now is the ability to integrate and get operational data to help inform proficiency, do inferred proficiency in many cases. Really use the data that's in your environment already to narrow the aperture on the things that you really need to put, more manual and kind of observed assessment and those types of measures in place. So that's the big sea change that we're seeing now is, that integrated environment where we can bring all that data together. And XAPI and things like that are really helping to shape where we can go with that.
Well, and I think it's right. It's an interesting point. You hit on a couple things. One, and I say this about a lot of stuff. Technology is an enabler. It's not the solution. So I think sometimes people are looking for, right, what is that tech solution that will just take all this off our plate? And it doesn't exist, right? There still is the hard work that goes into it. And I think, Tom, to your point earlier about, a lot of organizations, and I've been part of them, where you have a lot of this data, it exists, but it's here and it's there and it's not consistent and it's all over the place. That's not bad. I think sometimes people kind of beat themselves up a little bit about it, like, oh, we just have been doing it wrong. And it's like, you were doing what you could do in the environment you were in. It was the first step in kind of moving forward. And Jai, if I'm picking up on what you're saying, right, that isn't a bad thing, because that's a good foundation that you can start from. You just can't 100%. Stop there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say 80% of the engagements that we go into, our customers come to us with some framework. It just happens to be a framework that they've built and are starting to manage or have for years managed in Excel or SharePoint. And the good news is we can ingest all of that and very quickly turn it around in terms of a digital framework that now is codified in a database with business logic and business rules. And all of a sudden that stuff starts to come to life. And people say, oh, I can now take that data and I can build my shift schedule off of it. Or I can take that data and understand what my gap is to my customer demand 1, 2, 3 years down the road. And the light bulb just starts to go off. I can start to do my learning needs analysis, not based on how many people I hired into a particular job role, but what my specific competency and skill gap is against those learning offerings. And then I can turn around and measure effectiveness of those learning offerings and say, did they actually close that skill gap? Or did I just waste a bunch of money buying, third-party content that had no impact on my proficiency? That's where the connection really starts to happen for people, I think.
Well, and a question came through in the chat, and I'm actually going to jump forward to that and then jump back a little bit. But Lizelle was asking about, right, and you hit on it a little bit in terms of this, how does the content or your LMS, right, where some of this learning stuff happens, how then is that feeding into, Kahuna, or how is that being used? And I'm curious, how a lot of organizations are using that, because I think it does get to that point of, in many organizations, we have a lot of this stuff. There's maybe a lot of learning out there, but what are we getting for it, or how does that connect to the bigger picture? And that's one of the things that excites me about this kind of tech, is it allows LD to kind of jump out of the silo of, well, we're just kind of heads down in this space.
Yeah, Tom, I'm going to have you take this one. It's a big focus for us. That's all I'll say. And Tom,
and please build on it. So as you were saying, Jai, like the integration is one of the biggest things that have changed, right, of process and of technology over the last few years, and how we can enable, to your point, Chris, other processes. LMS integration in Kahuna, I'll talk about it in 2 different ways, and then Jai, you take it away. So first, on the technical level, it's key for us. We like to bring in like the learning catalog, the content from the LMS and then do that translation to what is the impact on competencies and skills in Kahuna. And then we bring in like the completion of that data into Kahuna from a very standard kind of perspective. And then in our system itself, it plays two really key roles. So one is your journey towards skills, proficiency, and competency, right? Some of our clients will have this as like an awareness proficiency level, if you will, for a competency. And that's driven by taking training, right? Understanding.
Foundational. Are you aware, right? Lowest level of stuff. Do you at least have cognizant awareness of this stuff?
Exactly that, yeah. And then in the system, we'll get into this later, where Jai was talking about operational data. That's what then takes you from awareness to application or whatever you want to call it in the system. So that's one part. And the other is what Jai said, kind of a more specific LXP, if you will. So what I have skill gaps, what is out there that will move the needle for me to close those skill gaps and start to take training to close skills rather than just because it's been assigned out in a curriculum. So that's the two real ways we see it. We're going to work on this a lot from a product evolution perspective and our roadmap using XAPI. There's a bunch of different ways we can unlock things with XAPI, understand how people are learning, what training has the biggest impact on skills, so on and so forth. But Jai, anything to add there?
Yeah, not really. Just that user journey. Just to put a fine point on answering this question. It is absolutely 100% enabled from the standpoint of me as a learner. I can now see exactly what's required and then what's referential relative to various skills, and I can link to that very specific learning item, regardless of whether it's in a corporate LMS, a third-party LMS that the company just refers to. It could be a reference document on SharePoint. So we kind of unlock that whole idea that everything has to just be in one kind of formal LMS, and we have a multimodal approach to linking you to the right resource in the right channel, if you will, to close that very specific skill gap.
Okay. Well, I'm curious, and we'll it'll be interesting to see as we go with this, because I think one of the things that's interesting in our space is sometimes the completion data gets a bit of a bad rap, right? It does. It's like, oh, well, completion data doesn't tell us anything. It's like, well, maybe, but maybe not, right? Because there is this lowest level of like, well, there is something to be said along the continuum of, well, you engage with it. That does tell us something about the fact you at least have some cognitive awareness that this is a thing and some basic foundation things. I think where it does fall is when we assume that means somebody's skilled at something.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, well, no, it doesn't necessarily tell us, but it is a data point. And I think to what you're talking about is the fact that where Kahuna is leaning in is saying, we're pulling that data point in with other data points to tell a more holistic picture around, well, what does Tom know and what is Tom able to do, so that we can then align that to the organization, say, well, where can he best do that? And then to your point, I guess, the other piece you talked about, which is where I think LXPs you're kind of a blend of that whole talent marketplace LXP space, where it's like, well, and you have these gaps, but rather than leaving it to you to figure out, so what do I do about those gaps? It's about being able to say, hey, and here's a path, or here's some things that can help you move that along.
One quick thing there is just connecting what you just did there, Chris, with what Jai was saying earlier about experience. And I think that is really key for us at Kahuna, is that, like you said, completion of learning, or just learning itself, has a really important place in the story of becoming competent and skilled. But there's a bunch of other stuff. So when you say, like, I've got a skill gap, what can I do about it? That's not always take training, right? That is get out there, have Jai mentor me on, whatever, running a workshop and doing it is so important. And that's really like something that we specifically focus on, is that if you think about like the old 70-20-10, like that 70% of stuff is really under marketed in the learning technology landscape, I think. So it's something
I agree. And I want to dig into that, but I said I was going to jump back, so I don't want to forget to jump back, because I think one of the things that I'm curious about with this is I think of the competency piece, right? You go back to kind of the start where you're building this framework and you're saying, all right, what really are and again, whatever you want to call them, competencies, skills,
Exactly.
capabilities,
Right.
right? Everybody's got a different word for them, but we're saying the same thing. What are the behaviors or the capabilities that somebody has that allows them to be good at something? When you look at that, and I'm curious how this, just more so from a workflow standpoint, works with organizations, because some organizations probably have a lot of that. Maybe it's scattered throughout. Other organizations may not have any of that. They may be earlier on in the journey. When you work with organizations, do you have some of that to kind of give people kind of a grounding, or do you also help benchmark? Because there may be people who have data, but it's not very good data, or it's like really outdated. And they may say, hey, this is what we think our competency model is. And because you're doing all this, you're looking at it going, yeah, and I don't know that I would really recommend that that's what we do. What does that process look like to make sure that you're actually starting from a strong foundation?
So we do have a very strong network of partners and content providers. It's not a business that we are particularly in terms of developing the framework itself. We have our perspective on what the right framework matchup is, at least as a starting point, a jumping off point. And it really depends on what the business objectives are of the customer. So the first thing we do as a software company, and sometimes this slows down our sales cycle, and that's okay. We run an exercise where we say, what are you trying to achieve? And because those could be very different outcomes. In one case, you may have a very safety relevant goal, or a very operationally driven goal, and in others it may be. We hope that they're all operational outcomes, but in another case it may be a softer development, retention. We have that problem we're trying to solve. And so, depending on what that objective is, we will then kind of narrow that aperture around, okay, these are the competencies that are going to make the most sense, or this is the scope of roles that we really want to affect. And then we can match you up with the right set of content or a content provider, because there are a lot of companies that just do that side of things very well.
Just to add like two thoughts there, Jai. So I think when you match up with a content provider and partner, kind of like you said, it's a great starting point, Chris, but in Kahuna and best practice, I think, come together nicely here. You have to work with the client to say what is special about you, what is the goal, like Jai said, that you're trying to achieve, and kind of work that into the content, right? So you can start with some really great off-the-shelf stuff, but I think there's like a calibration process you need to go through. And the other point I think is really important is in healthcare is a different story for us around content. We've partnered with Intermountain Healthcare Systems out of Utah, and they have great content that they have curated over the last 9 years, or a good period of time. They've curated them into roles. And we're really fortunate to be able to partner with them for other healthcare systems to say this is in practice this isn't like a content provider, this is a health system maintaining this to the right level of standards. So on healthcare specifically, it's a different story.
Yeah, well, and it's an important call out, right? Because every industry,
that's right.
I've seen people get into these debates where it's like, well, it's completely unique over here. It's like, well, there are certain components that are kind of unique. There's a lot that overlaps, but yeah, when you start digging in highly regulated industries, things like that, there are some nuance that you have to respect, and you can't just say, oh, it's the same. On that one though, I am curious this, and Jai, you hit on it earlier, but I think one of the important things you tackled, or that I think people should kind of mention, you talked about the fact that starting with the like outcome in mind may slow down the process. And I think it can, but I think it's a good slowdown, right?
Yeah.
To me, this is one of those things where it's like, I've seen people try and be like, well, we just need to hurry up. Let's jump to the end. And it doesn't go well, because it's one of those like, hey, we got to make sure we're planning and we're doing this the right way, so that as we move forward, it does speed it up. I think the phrase I've heard a lot is like, you go slow to go fast. Right. You go slow on the front end so that you can speed up. So I'm curious, and the reason I said that was to kind of hit on the next point, which is how then do people typically, do you see them starting at like the eat the elephant, like let's do this for every role in the organization? Or do you find people say, hey, let's start here let's really get this working, and then let's expand it out?
So for the customers that are replacing a system and they've put all the thought into their program, a lot of times that may be a full on, kind of big bang. We've got it all worked out. We're just looking for a technology solution to make this more efficient. That unfortunately isn't every customer, but that's okay. I think with the ones where we're helping to sell enterprise change and think about a different way of doing things, it's absolutely a phased approach, starting with the most critical roles, the willing victims, if you will, within the company because they've got a need, a dying need,
Yeah.
and that's what informs it. A big use case for us is field service, companies that have field service technicians, because ultimately there's a recognition now that I want to schedule and dispatch those workers that are best suited for the task that they're going to be asked to do. And you'd be so surprised how much content does exist as an HR person, you may not even be aware how much content exists in the operational groups at that granular level, because they've been having to figure this stuff out for so long. They've been having to figure out, who do I put on that next job that includes this, type of activity. And so, we're really good at helping customers mine that data and then kind of formalize it into our data model.
What's funny about that, and this is so true, right? Because I've been on the ops side of talent and learning for most of my career, almost all of it. There are so many pockets of data that I think on the HR side, they're not even aware, because the business is just like, we've just had to do this and we've just had to take care of it. And we didn't loop you in. We didn't have time to bring you into the fold because we just needed to get the work done. And it's amazing and to me, this is where it's a huge opportunity for the central HR function to really lean in and say, hey, we actually have a way to help you now. We have a way to help you solve your operational problems by listening, bringing this in and automating a lot of this stuff that, Tom, you said it, you've been doing with spreadsheets and you've been manually tracking all this stuff. And there's a lot of tribal knowledge that suddenly somebody leaves and that all goes with them. And what do you do with that?
To Jai's point about field services, they have procedures, right? Like that is very prescribed thing that you need to do when you go out into the field. That's a gold mine for HR. And Stacey Harris talks about this a lot. Making those relationships between HR, training, operations is so valuable. Resource managers, that everyone can help each other out and add a ton of value.
But HR's traditionally run away from this, because if I think about the tools that I had to offer, and if I think about trying to put this in my core HR system and actually make a difference, it starts to fall apart really quickly. And I'm going to look not so great, sponsoring a program like that. So ultimately,
you swooped in and said, I'm going to take this on, but I really didn't have the capabilities to take this on. And now they're like, you know what, give it back. And you've damaged the relationship, because they're like, no, give me back my spreadsheets. You just messed up our stuff.
One really foundational, fundamental thing that we've mentioned a bit throughout the conversation is job architecture. And I think that is something that is just an ongoing challenge for HR and operations, where they just think about this completely differently, right? Like HR is run on the job architecture side often by compensation, needs to be broad. Most HR systems think about job as that unique kind of object that runs the show. Whereas operations, engineer doesn't cut it, right? I'm a valves engineer in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's what I do. So for us, when we built Kahuna, solving for that translation, that difference has been really important. I think that can bring the groups together nicely.
Well, and I think that's where we talked a little bit about it. And then I've got a question that Lizelle asked again that I want to bring up. But I think this is where we've historically seen this, where some of the big systems, when you try and solve for everything, you can't really solve for anything super well, at least at the level of granularity that is required, and that honestly that operators require, because they're like, we can't operate on this high level kind of it's good enough type stuff. This is true P&L type impact that we're going to have if we don't do this right. And that's that's some serious accountability for people in our space who are like, we want a seat at the table. Like, well, just be ready because it gets hot sometimes. So make sure you're coming into it ready to go. So the question.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it first.
Oh, the good news about that, right? Like these applications, we talk about them sometimes being like a mile wide and a couple of inches deep. They're evolving. Something like Workday, they have a great API now. So we have some really good integrations with Workday where we do what we do really well. We're not trying to get into that space, and we just put the data back into use for talent management processes. We get data to help assignments be more kind of intelligent and so on. So I think if they keep doing that path,
well, and I think that's a shift I'm seeing in the tech marketplace in general. That's a positive one, right? Before everyone was trying to create their own island, their own kind of thing. And now this recognition that, hey, we can't all do everything with the level of specificity that we need. And so let's kind of feed this data together to be able to work as a holistic entity.
Yeah, a little shout out for, where technology and cloud technology in particular has gone with, at least somewhat plug and play integration, and providers like we're hosted on Microsoft Azure. So I always like to give them a plug because they're a great partner for us. But the democratization of application development, platform development. We would have never been able to do this in another generation or another era. We wouldn't have had the capital needs or the capital requirements to spin up the infrastructure and do everything we needed to do. And now we have a very secure, globally delivering platform that we were able to construct, to the phase and size of our company and continue to elastically expand that footprint. And that's not possible without cloud providers like Microsoft or AWS, places like that. And I think the customer benefits so greatly because now you can get specialization of functionality with integration, and you couldn't get that before.
Yeah. No, and I think that's where when you hear the arguments or kind of, the negative attitude of like, well, we haven't been doing this. It's like, well, honestly, for a long time you couldn't. It just was the evolution of technology has enabled things that weren't previously possible. And I think it was part of the reason I started this show was so that it's like, people just need to understand there are things that you have for years, decades thought, well, we just can't do that. And the answer is, yes, you can. You just need to know what's possible now because the rules have been dramatically changed. Okay, I would end up going off on this tangent for a long time. But so the question that Lizelle asked, that I think I'm curious on this one, right? When it comes to, and this gets back to kind of the measurement standpoint of, all right, how do we know what people actually know and what they can do? So, and don't apologize for the question, Lizelle. I love getting the questions from these assessments, right? As you're assessing what people know, how is that then incorporated? And is it a traditional assessment? Like, how are you pulling that together to start getting the profile of the employee?
I'm just going to say at its core, that's what Kahuna does, is it manages a multimodal assessment, essentially. That could be learning driven, observational, taking a quiz or some sort of knowledge test. It could be experiential. But what Kahuna does is allow you to construct a competency proficiency journey that could include one or all of those things to inform your current proficiency, and then compares that current proficiency against what the expectation for your role is. So you know whether you have a gap in which you want to close that gap, or you may be exceeding your role. And that becomes really interesting because then you can search for what's the next opportunity that this competency and proficiency has unlocked for me within the organization. We haven't really talked a lot about that side of things, but our platform also allows you to discover what else is out there that might be applicable for me in my career journey based on my current profile of skills and competencies.
Well, so let's jump to that. But go ahead, Tom. Finish.
Two real quick things on the question. One is like validation as well. As Jai said, we can have a blended approach, and for different competencies, one of those approaches will probably be best, right? So in the world of health and safety, you might just need to see your training matrix because that's a prerequisite to do anything out there. So learning driven key. The other thing to note is like, who is the validator? So if you're doing observations, who is the right person to do that observation, right? Most systems will say, hey, Jai's my boss, he's the right person to do that observation. But in Kahuna, we have a way to find assessors, essentially, using data to match up the right assessor. So I think that validation portion of assessment is key as well.
Well, and I think the follow-up question, and maybe this will get at the root of what she was getting at, so let me know, Lizelle, but I think is, right, so I'm thinking a lot of times when I do these on the shows, it's people are kind of grasping the workflow of this, right? How does this work? So, let's say, let's just do an example. Let's say you've got an organization that maybe has some learning data, and you're saying, hey, that's what we have. Are there some kind of like different options that are already built into Kahuna where you may say, hey, right, observations is something we don't have. Here's kind of a prefab thing. And this is how we would actually get that data in so that people can kind of say, oh, we have an incomplete data profile. What does a good data profile look like? And you can say, these are some different options that we can pull in from Kahuna, or is it just whatever you have, we'll figure it out type thing? Is there, and I think, because that's where sometimes people structure with, I get it needs a framework, but I don't even know what that framework could look like.
Yeah, and so I'll take that initially. The way Kahuna works is we ingest your framework if you have it. If you don't, it's apparent where you have gaps. But there, again, going back to what we said earlier, there's no replacing that work of determining, okay, these are the basic skills, competencies, experiences, behaviors that are important to the company. So there has to be that needs analysis, that identification of those things. Once those are identified, the building of the checklist or the observation or the quiz, that all kind of happens as you load that data into Kahuna. It automatically digitizes that checklist or presents those behaviors to be validated. So there's not an extra step there. Once you've determined what that content is, Kahuna takes care of the rest once it's imported, essentially. It'll expose it appropriately.
So, and I'm just, again, thinking from a workflow standpoint. So as an organization, you may say, hey, you're coming into the process and you're saying, here's what we got. And then as you're doing that needs analysis piece, you're looking at it saying, here's what you have. Here's some opportunities to improve and enhance that, at which point they can kind of create that framework and then bring that into Kahuna, which then now becomes digital and enhanced.
Yes, and that's a continuous improvement, even for very mature customers. It's not a one and done. Your organization's changing, it's flexing. Skills are important one day, they're not important the next. The good news about Kahuna is that you can change the makeup of a role, and really that the most current idea of what is important to that role is presented to the user, but all that historical stuff doesn't go away. It stays with you because that stuff may come back. It may not be a priority today, but it's a priority.
Know what it was for historical purposes, things like that. Okay.
Right.
Well, and I think that helps with kind of paint the picture of what that looks like and help people kind of structure what that is. Okay. So what was the piece you said that we didn't get into yet? Oh, right. Okay. So let's say you're opening opportunity for employees who may be saying, I've been doing this, right? I have these skills, but like, what do I do with them, and where does that opportunity exist? So how does that work then?
So in Kahuna, we have a very specific piece of functionality called, we called it the role predictor. And essentially this is meant to kind of show the end user kind of lateral and horizontal opportunities for you. So it's going to look at your history, like you said, Chris, everything you've got, not just what's currently assigned to you, but things you've brought with you from different varied roles. And it's going to do that real-time kind of algorithmic matchup to, hey, here is a role that you are already 50% developed towards. Here's your gap. Here's the things that you want to focus on. Here's the things that help you focus on those. So it kind of offers that up to the employee. The cool thing is the way that a lot of our clients kind of structure their competencies is that they would have like a core taxonomy that goes across multi-disciplines, multi-functions, right? Like you said, not everyone's unique. And then you'll have like your bolt-ons that are very specific to a role. So when you're doing this matchup, you can see where you have like a good amount of overlap and some specific things you need to develop.
Got it. Well, and it gets to the point that, I was kind of getting at with the whole competency framework is just like with jobs and career, career ladders, career jungle gyms, whatever term you want to call. A lot of times people struggle with a blank canvas, right? Where you're like, well, you have these skills. What do you want to do with it? I don't know, right? I'm not really sure. I'm not sure what the organization needs or where I may be able to contribute more. I think I'm doing my best, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think you look at employee engagement, that is a huge contributor to poor engagement scores, is when people feel stuck and then the assumption is made, well, they don't want to do anymore. I think a lot of times it's not they don't want to. A lot of times employees just don't know what else they can do within an organization.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's like, figure it out.
So let's talk about kind of where some of our customers are taking this, because they're introducing, I don't particularly love this term, but I do think it's applicable. They're introducing a certain amount of gamification to this process. And so the way they're doing that is they are weighting certain skill and proficiencies and saying, I'm going to give you a point value if you achieve a certain set of skills. So I can kind of direct where users should be focused. And in some cases, they're taking it all the way to automatically positively impacting compensation when you hit certain thresholds. So we would actually have an interface or an integration out to their payroll system that says, hourly rate goes up by X because they've hit this next threshold of point achievement relative to skills. And from a pay equity standpoint and paying based on skill achievement versus other factors, huge. Remove bias from that, right?
It's huge in two, right? Like you said, in two ways it's huge. First of all, one, in terms of there's nothing worse, and this is where I've seen this just go down like the Hindenburg, is when you're trying to say, hey, right, we want you to grow skills, we want you to develop, we want you, right? It's a very organizational heavy benefit. We want this from you.
Right.
And when your employee starts feeling like, I'm doing all this, you're getting all the benefit from my skills, I'm better, I'm more efficient, I'm able to do more, I'm contributing more to the organization, what's in it for me? And the answer is nothing.
Right.
that actually has a counter, like it counters the efforts that you're putting, because it starts to feel a little bit like, well, wait a minute, I'm putting all this work in and I'm not seeing any of the benefits. So I love the fact that, right, organizations are taking it to this next level. And that doesn't, to your point, it doesn't always necessarily mean, a promotion or, a different job. It might mean, well, you're at a different tier within your job, or there's some financial incentive behind it that makes it worthwhile. And to your point about the equity behind it, there's nothing more frustrating to employees when they see, right, not only is there pay inequity, but the person who's up here is not more skilled at the job.
Tenure or who they know, right? Exactly.
Like that just crushes engagement.
Yes, agreed.
The one thing to add to what Jai is saying is how that enables multi-skilling as well, right? Like it incentivizes the employee to think outside what is currently assigned to them. And one of the clients that's using this is just thinking about how can we, right now with COVID, with everything going on, we're asking more of our employees. We have less resources, we're asking more. How can we make that more consumable to the employee, give them more visibility, then reward them for it? So I think it's a really nice way to underline the objective of the program.
No, I like it. So one comment that came in, and I'm actually really curious about this. I was going to ask about this, so thanks, boss, for reminding me of it. Is, Jai, you talked about this a little bit earlier of, right, it's about flexibility and agility, and not necessarily saying, all right, we did this, let's put it on the shelf, let's call it a day, we'll revisit in 20 years when the next pandemic hits, and we have to kind of panic again and figure this out. So with that, how do you work with organizations? I think one of the big messages here is this is not a once and done, clap your hands type things, but that is an adjustment. And that's something, I mean, this is a lot of work. What we're talking about is
Yeah.
it's a lot of work that goes into it. And it's not work that you get to just be done with. It's kind of an evolutionary thing. So how do organizations tackle that?
Agreed. We're creating a cultural shift here, a culture of assessment, a culture of skill identification. But I'm going to use one very specific example because of COVID to highlight flexibility and how managing change is actually enabled in Kahuna versus something that becomes a chore. So we mentioned healthcare a couple times. Obviously, healthcare operations, healthcare skills, capabilities hugely impacted by COVID. Overnight, telehealth became an absolute imperative to ensure revenue. Overnight, I'm trying to identify who from my ICU can go, or if from my emergency room can go work in the ICU, or who from my operating room can go work in my ICU. Who knows ventilators, so on and so forth. What's that gap? What's the time to close that gap? That is managing change. That's being flexible. So our healthcare clients were using Kahuna to push out new requirements, to discover talent, to do things like run whole programs around how do I upskill in telehealth, because my revenue depends on that. And so they boiled that down to very specific behaviors that they needed to see in people. They boiled it down to a few training offerings around, PPE, donning PPE. They could use the system to automatically expire everyone's competencies in safety critical areas and then retrain them because notifications were pushed out. So that idea of managing change, I think, was super highlighted in that environment. And if you can start to push that out and think about that relative to digital transformation or other organizational initiatives that are impactful to people's skills and behaviors, once you have that framework, the cost is in that, and the effort is really in that initial rollout. Once you have a sustaining process, we can really help and keep that as a sustaining activity.
Okay. Well, and so from a change because I think it's a really important one, because when you look at the employee base and just people in general, one of the biggest challenges for initiating change is helping people understand why the change is even happening, right? The what's in it for me, and like, why is this even going on? So I'm curious in that instance, because I think it's a perfect example, right? All of a sudden COVID hit, telehealth hits, and you're like, who even knows how to do, right? Who even knows how to have an appointment, through this new capability, and we don't know. And all of a sudden, if you're a physician, you're kind of mad that all of a sudden, like, now my credentials expired or things like that. Now, in managing that change, obviously there's a lot more that goes into it than just expiring credentials and saying, hey, now you got to go do stuff. But are people layering some of that kind of storytelling through Kahuna, or how are they managing that? Because that is a big challenge. And we experienced that full force in 2020.
Tom, you want to talk a little bit about Cameron and the engineering population? I think that's a good example of where, and you are intimately involved with that implementation. So.
Yeah, totally. So at the moment, it's really focused on like program management, I think, and Cameron's a good example of where they have like an SME community that runs this. They own this. Talking about HR working with operations, get the ops folks to really own the outcome and the support of this. So when things occur, they have these community meetings of SMEs. They talk about the impact. They work with their specific groups to kind of communicate the why, the what's in it for you, the why things are changing, and they also kind of in parallel make the updates to the application. So that's reworking that.
And change management is you're 100% correct, Chris. Like without change management, these programs don't go forward. There has to be an explanation of the various stakeholder analysis and what's in it for each stakeholder. We're lucky enough to have actually hired the person who ran the Cameron program. She now heads up a lot of our change management activities, has a very good perspective on what it means to engineers, what it means to field service technicians, what it means to the executives in terms of the access to the data as well. So really can help develop those strategic messaging. And we obviously help in that arena when we engage with a customer and support them.
Yeah, that's one reason why that, like you mentioned earlier, Chris, like rolling out to smaller groups and kind of rather than a big bang, it's so effective because you create these like internal change agents that own the program and can show their peers, in person normally, but virtually now, like, hey, did you see what we've done with this data? Look what we can do. And that kind of creates that atmosphere of change.
And that flywheel effect is crazy. That flywheel effect is pretty awesome to see within organizations. When you have your customer champion walking into a executive meeting and able to show analytics on the capabilities of their particular staff, and everyone's looking around the room saying, "How come I don't have that data?" It's pretty impactful, and we've seen that especially in the age of COVID when people were really trying to get their hands on where are we as an organization? And that's where we saw engagement really tick up in our customer base is our champions were out there with the data at their fingertips and all their peers were saying, how come I'm not there? How come I don't have that same visibility? And so, we saw a lot of
innovation thing, right? Start creating a little bit of incentivization to be like, well,
absolutely.
Hey, this group has all this data and insights on their talent. They're actually mobilizing it. They've increased efficiency. They have and they have the data to prove it. It's not just a gut feel like we think we're doing a good job. It's a data-based approach,
empirical approach. Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and that drives what is in it for the organization as well, right? Showing that data, showing that you can impact real operational outcomes is really the key.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I knew we would run out of time, but as I look at as we wrap things up, we've hit on a couple things that I don't think are necessarily like, well, I guess I would call them watch outs, right? Like, are there watch outs as if you're considering stepping into this space? What are some things that you just have to take into account? We talked about the change management piece, right? If you think you're just going to enable something and just throw it out at the org and that's it, are there any other big kind of like, hey, these are things to be thinking about if you're considering embarking on this journey? And again, we've only got a couple minutes to dig into them. Like, are there just some big?
I'll give you three.
Perfect.
If your program's not tied to an operational outcome, question the motivation and the ability to have success with that program. If your program is not inclusive of functional and technical competencies at the role level, thinking about the actual work that gets done, I question whether that's a true, what we call real skilling. By the way, we didn't even get into that, where we branded or trademarked a new term for all of it.
We got a new buzzword. Okay.
Yeah, so we're calling it real skilling, and because of we feel like these programs are rooted in reality and make a real difference. But so if your program does not get to that role level, and then finally, if you're not integrating this data into decision making for downstream processes that consume this data, you will become an island of data that will crush in its own weight, because no one's going to know that this data exists and be able to take advantage of it. So those would be my three watch outs. One, make sure it's tied to a business outcome. Two, make sure you're getting to the right level of specificity and granularity. And three, make sure you're integrating the data to downstream systems and decision making.
That's the second one. All three of them make perfect sense, and I think they're great calls. I think the second one is one that I really want to highlight with that, because I think sometimes that's where there's a bit of a miss, where we think, well, we've established competencies, but they're up here, right? They're up here, versus when you really dig into ops, it's that doesn't cut it, right? Communication, that's not specific enough for an operational team to say, well, we need to actually know what these people do on an operational level to be able to action against that. To your point, tie back to a business outcome, right?
Exactly.
It has to be able to.
And that drives engagement, right, Chris? So if it's really high and abstract, then what's in it for me? But if it's talking the same language as me as a field tech, then I know that I need to do this. It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been super fun. Wait, were you gonna say one more thing, Jai?
Well, I was going to turn the tables on you, Chris, and put you on the spot. Will you come on our podcast sometime? We'd love to have you.
Yeah, sure. Why not? Right.
All right. All right. Now, thank you very much.
And I said it live, so now I have to do it. Right. I'm obligated. That's why you did it.
100%.
Okay. Well, no. So this has been fantastic. Again, I think it's one of these things, right? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work, but it's a lot of work, in my opinion, that is worthwhile and is going to get us the things that we're trying to do, right? That we've been saying we want to do for so long, and it's in the best interest of the orgs. It's in the best interest of our employees if we do it right. And I think, Jai, you said that in the beginning. It's worth it to take the time to do it right and make sure that it moves forward. So hopefully everybody, we had a big audience across multiple channels here. Hopefully we got all your questions answered. We could talk about this significantly longer, but maybe another time. So thank you for being here, Jai. Tom, great chatting with you. Thanks everybody for joining in and getting your questions and engaging in the conversation. And we will see you next week. Have a great weekend,
Thanks,
everybody.
Chris. Really appreciate it, man. Thank you.